Greetings, Coach Fleischer here, and for this presentation, we'll be building on what we talked about in our previous presentations regarding movement. Specifically, we talked about the comparison of single joint and multi-joint movement, talked a little bit about types of contractions, and we're going to take this a step further and go into and add some different verbiage into the equation and go ahead and overlay concentric and eccentric with positive and negative phases. Reason being, when you look at exercise, it's pretty darn easy to look at perhaps one joint and go, my elbow joint is closing, it's okay, concentric for the bicep, cool. If I'm pushing down and doing a tricep push down, as you'll see, concentric looks a little bit different, right? It's when the elbow is opening. So as a practitioner, you start to have this mindset where you have to categorize movement patterns. And sometimes it gets a little bit complex and you have to go ahead and find different ways to actually categorize your movement. So if we look at concentric and eccentric, it's really easy, like I said, to do a bicep curl and kind of have that in your head when we talk this through, and you'll see this in the videos coming up. On the concentric side, it's the positive phase. On the eccentric side, it's the negative phase. And with the more complex movements, it is more tied to the primary muscle that's being used. And as we'll see in another presentation, you start to break down your movements in these complex movement patterns into what are you really after and what are you trying to focus on. And as a result, where is the positive and where is the negative phasing that is seen in exercise. But for today, it'll be pretty self-evident and straightforward, and this will serve as a bit of a bridge to our next presentation. So looking at these two side by side, and you've seen these both before, and you've seen me do 1,000 bicep curls already, and you've seen this one in another presentation kind of foreshadowing this. So from the right side, single joint, right, SJ, single joint, very simple, only one joint is moving. I did allude to the fact that to make this movement happen, you have to have a couple other things going on in terms of isometric movement where you have to fire muscle to help you stabilize, but for the sake of our conversation, in this class, we're looking at just the elbow is moving at this point. The bicep is contracting. You have this concentric contraction. The elbow is closing. That would be your positive phase. If we come over here and we look at what's going on, pay attention to the whole kinetic chain. The ankle, the knee, the hips, plural, the shoulder, the elbow, and the wrist, and how all of those have to move in this very complex movement pattern. So let's go and do some more bicep curls real quick. And now compare that with this. Very, very easy to see in this one what is positive and negative. Positive, negative, concentric, eccentric. Over here, the way I would categorize this, and hopefully this is not getting too garbled as I'm doing the voiceover on when I'm doing these. Positive, negative, positive, as you're pushing forward. You know, on this exercise, you have this weight transfer. You have this multi-joint exercise up here as you're pushing forward. And as you're pushing forward, wrist, elbow, and shoulder are all articulating. The different joints in the back, the different facet joints or layers of the spine are all articulating. The hips, both of them, the knees both move, and then the ankles are both moving. So really, if you can count out the number of joints here that are moving versus here, it's vastly different. And so, as we'll see in our next presentation, you have, as you categorize this, I would tend to categorize the positive phase while pushing on this one, and then the negative phase while coming back and working against that resistance because the resistance is behind me. I'm trying to push, and in that pushing phase, it becomes a positive phase. Here, it's very straightforward, very simple. All right, moving on. Thank you. I had to get another rep. So the way we overlaid this, and I talked about it just previously, was as we're doing the bicep curl and the weight is coming up, that is the concentric phase, that's your positive phase. As the weight is coming down, it's the eccentric phase, it's the negative phase. So as a practitioner, you can start to really kind of dig in and go, arm group, specifically the biceps, the exercise is a bicep curl, it's a single joint exercise. We know it's elbow flexion and extension. And we know in that process the elbow is closing and opening. And we also know positive, negative phase. So you have the concentric side as while it's closing, and the eccentric side is while it's opening the elbow. And so the positive phase is while you're contracting. So gosh, that means while the bar is coming up and the elbow is closing. You can connect the dots between those, right? And be able to do any exercise that's single joint really easily figure out what is happening. Positive, negative, concentric on the way up, eccentric on the way back down. Tricep push down. A little different with this, as you know, because the resistance is being offered up top, your concentric phasing is different because as you're extending the elbow, the muscle on the back of the arm is making that movement happen. So the concentric, the contracting part on the back of the arm is when you're extending the elbow. So much like before, your positive phase and negative phase can be seen here. It's pretty easy, but it's flip-flop, right? So as you're extending the elbow, you're contracting the tricep, that's your positive phase. So the phasing is exactly the opposite, but you know it's the arm group, you know it's a tricep push down, you know the triceps are working, it's a single joint exercise, the elbow. You're going through elbow flexion and extension, elbow closes, elbow opens, but the negative and positive phasing is flip-flop on this side. You'll notice compared from the previous slide to get my point across that the phasing's different as you go through flexion extension of the elbow. So I'm gonna get myself some more tricep push downs. And the part that needs to kind of get across here too is you can even see this, I'm kind of wobbling back and forth, a little pendulum going on here. And that gives you the clue that, heck, there's other muscles that are working here to help keep me stable. And I'm challenging those with the weight that I have. It's subtle, but you can see it, and you'll see that with your clients and patients. So again, this video itself and this presentation, the introduction to positive and negative is pretty easy to see in the first couple of slides where I compared that very complex multi-joint exercise of pivot and push to the lesser or very simple and basic bicep curl. You should be able to visually get the differences between those two and realize that when you get into more complex exercise, positive and negative sometimes is the way to go. But as you'll see in the next video, you can really have some fun when you get into and start evaluating movement patterns and what is actually positive, what is actually negative, what is an active contraction or a passive shortening of a muscle or an active shortening of a muscle or active or passive lengthening of a muscle. So it really, you end up in this conversation with people who are in this industry where you can kind of go through and really get kind of like ad nauseum talking about this stuff. But it's kind of fun once you get into it. So with this, I'm going to sign off and jump over to the next presentation so we can start talking about multi-joint work and be on the lookout. Signing off.